Darrah, buddy, I appreciate you so much for stopping by and sharing your all wisdom. So thanks for coming. It's great to have you here, and it's great. I think this is your trifecta, actually.
It is. This is my third lap.
I love it. Um, Tell us what you've been up to lately.
That's a loaded question. So, you and I were talking offline about me building a house, which has been a really interesting crucible for learning. We are recording this coming up on the end of a calendar year, and I am doing a lot of early reflections on what happened in this year, beginning to carve out the space to do some vision casting for the next year. All in all, it's been one of the best years as far as business revenue, as far as amount of time spent in work, which means less than in the past, which means I spilled one of my companies this year. One of my intentions going into this year was to release the things that no longer served me, which I have a feeling feels very aligned for you as well. And looking back on this year, I'm beginning to see how that was selling a property, it was selling a business, it was releasing friendships that I didn't think needed when I made that intention to be released, which I later learned was the case. And, a lot of it was also just beliefs and mindsets within myself.
Hmm. I love we were talking earlier before recording about you building a house, but what I had said to you, which I'll say again, is I just love watching you operate in the world. Like you've done so many incredible things, especially for somebody your age. And it's like, you've written a book and you have had networking events and built companies and all of the things. And I'm wondering if you're willing to share with us under the hood of what that looks like because I think one of your gifts is you just organically unravel some things, but you have this innate ability to turn something that is an idea or a dream or a visualization or whatever that is into something real and tangible. And I know a lot of the people listening, I've heard this question like countless times, which is like, how do I know what my purpose is? Or they feel somewhat unsettled. And it's that whole, in some cases, golden handcuffs, the indoctrination and the socialization of, here's what life should look like. You're supposed to get a job and it's supposed to be, a secure job if possible. And you don't have to love it and it doesn't have to light you up, but, ideally it's going to pay the bills. But also what happens to those individuals is typically they're suffering in silence and silos because that's what they were told life is supposed to look like. And then enter you, and just not only a breath of fresh air, but you're out here doing all of these things and building life by design and helping people find their purposes and build businesses and grow businesses. And what advice would you give those people?
So, first, thank you. Second, I want to lean in first on that creation piece. And I think I happen to sit in this kind of unique space where I am like equally left brain and right brain, and I am equal parts sort of woo woo and like my foot in that dimension, as well as super grounded, practical, and strategic. And so it's so interesting to see someone mirror you back to yourself, which I think is one, why I coach, because I think having people in our corner who are doing that, who are holding us accountable, who are helping unearth the things in us that maybe we take for granted or we don't see for ourselves as important. And so in this space, thank you for doing that for me, where you're pointing out things that I take for granted because they come quite naturally. And so in the case of, whether it's the businesses, let's say it's my first company, the credit card processing company that my twin and I grew into 38 states, that I didn't go into that and say, I know exactly what this is going to look like 13 years from now, which is where I stand today. I didn't know exactly how I'd get there. I certainly didn't know the two embezzlements would be on the horizon. I didn't know I would be faced with so much insecurity and doubt from my family and all these other things that arise through that process. But I did know that I wanted to grow that business. And so with that information, I thought, okay, what are sort of just the first actionable steps that I can take to move it in that direction? And I think what underpins that is just a simple belief that it is possible. So even though at the time I wasn't like, yes, absolutely, this is going to work, part of me had to know enough to believe enough to move into that direction. And so it's sort of that balance of the sort of manifester world and the do everything you can with sheer will, force, and hustle and grit to get it done. And I think we often live in these, like your word, siloed establishments where it's either all or the other. And we either are just like, you just do your affirmations and you just journal and you do your daily meditations and just keep your vibration high. And I'm sounding like I'm mocking it, but I'm not. I believe in all of those things, but I don't think those things independently are it. It has to be met with action. And then on the other side is where the action piece comes in. And it's where I think the really detrimental cultural norms have gotten the best of us, particularly in entrepreneurial culture around hustle, grind, burnout, do everything you can to make this happen, push through walls. It's very masculine energy.
Mhm.
And there's nothing wrong with those things independently, but anything to an extreme is too far. And so I think what I have always been able to do without the language for either piece initially was blend the two, where it's taking the belief, even if it's that tiny kernel of belief of, well, this could be possible. I've seen something like this done before. I've seen this exact thing done before, even though I have no experience in this particular thing, figuring out how to cobble together some early confidence in oneself, even if it's shaky. That is the one thing that has always been my Achilles heel is confidence. So for anyone listening that's like, that's easy to say, it's like, no, it's not easy to say. Oftentimes the action is the thing that builds the confidence. So sometimes you have to invert the thing. Sometimes you're just like, well, let me do that thing and that'll give me the confidence. And other times you're like, well, I have a little bit of confidence enough to take that first step. And the smaller you make that step, the less daunting it feels and the easier it is to then say, well, what's appearing next? What could that next thing be? Rather than, I think, what gets so many people caught up, which is feeling like they need the entire vision, which is, I think, also part and parcel with this really old school business practice of like having to have a fully mapped out business plan for the next 10 or 20 years, which, unless you're applying for a small business loan or a grant or something where they're really requiring of that, I think it's a huge waste of one's time, because then you're going to look at it and be like, how in the world do I get there? And two, there's just no way you have any idea where that's really going to go. And so on the manifestor brain side, it's great to have an intention, but we have to release it. So if you need a roadmap, have it be one that you can hold loosely enough that you can say, okay, now how do I reverse engineer from the end to get to this, from this starting point to just the next step, and only focus on that next step and that next step and that next step with a little bit of a horizon looking out. You look like you're going to say something, so I want to give you a chance if you're going to before I talk to you about the purpose piece.
Yeah, I just we can tag it on now or in the end, but how does somebody know when it is a yes for them? You know, like you were just saying, you had the possibility, you thought it could happen, but there are things that we could do, and there are things that we should do, but you know that like hell yes in your body. How do you know what is that and what is the voice of 1,000 grains of sand of society telling you? You should, this is what, kind of you should do. Like if you're a woman, you should do this. If you're a white woman, you should do that. If you're whatever that looks like. How do
Yeah,
you,
I mean,
how do you register that in your body?
you've already hit on a couple of the important points. One is like the shoulds. Anytime it's coming from a place of should, I think there should be a question on it. Doesn't mean that you don't actually want that thing, but there should be that self inquiry of, do I actually want that? Or is that coming from the outside? And if it's coming from the outside, does it feel aligned with me? Which comes to that second piece of, you're talking about feeling in your body. Some people are really connected to themselves, and this will feel more simple than for others. Like I was raised to be very disconnected from any sort of quote feminine traits and characteristics in my emotion spectrum. So this was not natural for me. I was very disconnected from my body and my feelings. So I relate to anyone who might struggle with this. But it's often what we'd consider that like gut feeling, or that feeling in our chest. And when you can like feel your body tensing up, your shoulders might be getting tense, you might be holding the tension in your jaw. That is your body signaling tension. That is your body signaling there's some sort of contraction in response to this idea, versus expansion when things feel at ease, when it feels light, when it feels exciting, when your mind immediately starts going to the potentials and the possibility, and it's already making up the stories in its head of, it could be, it's like when you start dating someone and immediately you're like, oh, I see this future and I see this future and we could be doing this and we could be doing that. It's the same thing with possibilities that happen in our professional life, in every part of our lives. When your mind starts doing that, that's a really good tell that that's something worth pursuing and leaning into a little bit. But also to keep in mind that no decision has to be forever, and that no decision in and of itself has to be something that is going to move in the exact direction that maybe you set it out to be in the first place. So if you were to say, okay, maybe this is the industry that I want to move into, and you take a first step, doesn't mean you've put your flag in the sand forever, that you have to own it and do it. I mean, you and I have such, backgrounds that are windy to some people, but we see the through lines. There's so many parts of them that don't seem to make sense on paper, but we understand sort of the grounding effect. Like for me, it's connecting people to people and people to resources to better the outcomes for everyone, whether that was through writing a kid's book on financial literacy or networking events company or credit card processing or coaching entrepreneurs. They sound so cattywampus from the outside, but internally there is a through line. So at the end of the day, it's just understanding enough of yourself. And in order to get to that place of knowing, it's just getting still enough with yourself and trusting yourself enough, because oftentimes we allow the counsel, like everyone else outside of ourselves, to weigh in. And typically you can kind of tell like which ones you're getting defensive about or which ones you're like, yeah, totally, because you're really knowing what you want internally and you don't necessarily need that outside counsel, but rather than let it sway you, maybe let it confirm or deny for you. But
Mhm.
an exercise that I find very simple that can be really telling is to just close one's eyes, sort of take some breaths, almost like you were going to meditate, whether or not it's a practice that you have, and ask yourself directly in sort of the yes or no format or in the like black and white version, if that's plausible for the thing of like, should I do that or should I not? Or do I want that thing or do I not want that thing? And just sit with that reality and almost like let yourself visualize it for a second. And you will be amazed that your body will do one of three things. It will tense, it will feel really good and expansive, or it will be neutral and nothing will happen. For it tensing, that's a really good sign of a no. Let's keep it moving and look for another option. If it feels really good and expansive, that's a great yes, or at least a yes for that first step. And if it's neutral, then it either means ask something differently or it either way will be fine. And it's almost like your body is your magic 8 ball. And it sounds so simplistic, but there's really something to it, because at the end of the day, I was talking to a client about this the other day who was so externally motivated by, the metrics and the revenue and the growth and all of those things in his business. And he kept saying to me, there's these things that I want to do that really light me up. And even though I'm making tens of millions a year, it doesn't bring me any satisfaction anymore. But these things don't move the needle. So what's the point? And I said to him, wouldn't the point be to honor yourself? What more would be the point than to honor the thing that you are telling me is the thing that actually excites you now, when that other stuff is working and it's not at its detriment? But what matters more than that? So at the end of the day, I think it's just sitting stilly enough with yourself to ask those questions and to trust yourself and to know that even if things, quote, don't go the right way, that might have been the actual right way because it's going to open up a new pathway to something else. I mean, it's so cliche at this point, but it feels appropriate to remind everyone that it is through the failures, through the, things that don't go the way that we want, that we really learn things. If it weren't for those embezzlements in my company, if it weren't for my family telling me they didn't believe in my brother and myself to grow that business, if it wasn't for the people who told me no time and again with so many different endeavors, I wouldn't have built within myself the things I needed. I wouldn't have built the relationships that I needed to open the right doors. Like so many things wouldn't have happened as a after effect of that thing happening. So when we can look back and look at the big picture, the pieces obviously make sense. So when we're in those moments where things don't seem to make as much sense or we feel friction or resistance, it's really then about us saying to ourselves, my causing the internal resistance to this thing that I don't quote want is actually the problem, because the thing in and of itself is neutral. So how do I make the determination to release that resistance and just let it be what it is? And I love to look at life like a scavenger hunt. It's like, well, what's on the other side of that thing that feels really, really annoying and unpleasant right now? Because there's got to be something there. Otherwise, like, I just choose to not believe that it would be happening otherwise. And I think at the end of the day, whether or not that's quote true, our perspective and reaction and response to things that happens to us is the entirety of our reality and our existence. So that's just my choice and the way that I want to look at it.
That is one of the best answers I've ever heard. Like
Thank
so,
you.
so thorough and beautiful. But the thing that I also want to point out to everybody listening is that you are listening to your body, but also are an expert in making the unfamiliar familiar. So a lot of people will start at the starting line and they're like, "Oh, I want to build a business or I want my life to look like this." And it's so far removed from who they are or what they're accustomed to or any sort of realm of success that they've had thus far. But one of the things that I love about you is you're almost like caterpillar, butterfly, caterpillar, butterfly, right? And so for everybody listening, there is that moment where you look at that place that you want to be, and you're like, oh, well, that's not who I am. But we forget that in between where we are and where we end up is the becoming, right? And so the entire theme for the relaunch of this podcast is believe, belong, become. But before you can become something, you have to, if you trace the root all the way back, there was a moment where you believed you could, or at least you believed that someone knew, or you sought out a resource, or the saying, you can't steer a parked car. You took a step, and maybe that was just enough. So you get to the intersection and you can look left and you can look right, a vantage point that you didn't have had you not started moving.
So you said something that flagged an idea for the listeners with a resource. And it's that idea of, if you don't see it in yourself, how do you, I love to call it borrow confidence. How do you borrow that confidence from people who see it in you? It's going to sound name droppy, but it's not the intention. When Deepak Chopra and I had our series together, and he pulled me out of anonymity completely, which I'm still quite anonymous, but he pulled me out of anonymity from 7 billion people on the planet and said, you can help me make my work less esoteric and more palatable for people to understand. And I immediately thought to myself, me? Why? There's 7 billion people. You could have chosen any one of them to do that, but you chose me. And in that moment, I made this choice where it's again, sort of that what happens when you get into stillness regularly, where I was able to sort of float outside of myself and say, this man sees something in you. It is really imperative for you to borrow the confidence he has in you until you can really see and understand it for yourself, and lean in. And so that's what I did. But my point is, I have a resource called the 9 Questions to Ask Your Network to help you find your path. And I think what's so beautiful about this, and people can get it on my website, it's just darrah.co/freebies, and you'll see it amongst the list of free resources, is that it allows you to go to, a number of people in your life you choose, but I like to say at least 10 from different spaces and places, and ask these same 9 questions. And you do it in writing so it's not awkward for you. And it's not reciprocated, so that they're not worried about you doing this in reverse and that they can't be fully transparent. But it's asking a lot of those questions that help that you understand in yourself, like we talked about, the things you might take for granted, the things other people see in you as your superpowers or your gifts that maybe you're just not giving enough credence to. And this is exactly what I did in my early 20s. It was a long time ago when I really felt stuck. And I was like, the things that other people seem to be building lives and careers on seem so obvious to them. Like, I went to a university where almost everyone became a doctor, lawyer, or consultant. And I came out and I wanted to be in fashion. I went into fashion, but I was thinking, like, my skills feel way softer. They don't feel like the thing that is celebrated on the athletic field or in the arts or in this space or in that space. And it wasn't packageable in a way that I had seen before. And so when I started to pay attention to things my friends would mirror to me, just in our conversations, they'd say, like, Darrah, you are the best connector I know. You always know who to put me in touch with. I was like, everyone can do that. Like, why are you even calling that out? And they would say to me, it's not that no one can't do that. It's that you do it better than other people. It's just your natural proclivity. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so when I started using these 9 questions, things like, when do you see me at my best? What do you think is something I don't know about myself? And a number of other questions. And you begin to put them together and suss out the patterns, not the individual things, because those we can think of as outliers, but the patterns, that it begins to emerge for us, something that we can then say, wow, all these people see this in me. It's time to really reflect on how I can put that into spaces in my life, in my business, or my career. And I think that's where confidence can begin to also build. And it's also where this idea of purpose that you brought up, Shelli, comes up, because I'm a big believer that purpose can embody and incarnate in so many different ways. And so I'm also not a big fan of the idea of purpose of, like, you have one and it's this holy grail thing you have to find and you better figure that out or you're wasting your days. I just don't believe that. I think that we can become very passionate about our circumstances and we can be purposeful in the things that we do, and those can grow into our passions and or our purpose. And that the way that that shows up will likely change through the course of our life. But it's why it's important. It's why I always work with my clients to discern their top core values. It's also a free resource on my website if you want to understand what those are, because those should be North Stars that are the things we keep buoying ourselves to. So for example, my top 3 values are freedom, are growth and learning, which is sort of 2, but it's 1, and connection. And anytime I feel askew or unfulfilled or stuck, I think back and I'm like, where am I off on one or more of these? And it is always a telltale. It is always a, oh, I see, I'm like really over indexing over here and it's working truly against and creating friction against these values. And when I can assess and do that quick analysis and then reorient, it really changes things. And so when you start to put those pieces together, it's not about unearthing this like mystical, magical tidbit gem of this is my purpose. And some people will feel that way. Some people probably have known since they were born or very early on when they had cognitive ability to say, like, I know I am designed to be blank. And they do that and it feels beautiful for them and they remain energized by it. For others of us, like myself, that is not the case. That has never been the case. And it continues to change over time. But I think that we have to just give ourselves permission to say that that's okay and to test and experiment enough to say, I don't have to claim this one thing forever, like we were talking about before.
That's so powerful. I love the thing you said, excuse me. You said you can execute passionately. And it reminded me of Elizabeth Gilbert did a talk, and she was talking about passion. And she always used to speak about passion, passion, passion. And she talks about this one time. She was in Australia and she's delivering her keynote speech, once again, talking about passion and about, she like you said, known from the time she was knee high to a grasshopper that she was going to be, wanted to be, and had to be a writer. And she got back to her hotel that evening, and she was looking through her emails, and she had an email from somebody who was at the event that night. And it read something like, I know that you probably won't get this, you get so many emails, but I was at the event tonight and I just felt really called to reach out to you because, I was at your talk and I listened to you, and I've never felt worse about myself than I have today. And the reason is because I want to know what my passion is, and I want to be able to be as clear as you. And the fact that I don't know is why I came, and now I feel even worse about the fact that I don't know what my passion is. So Elizabeth Gilbert in that moment never ever gave the speech on passion, but instead she started exploring the concept of curiosity. And she said, there's people like me, and her partner, her best friend Rhea, who she ended up marrying, was a curious. She calls them pollinators, where they'll go from this to that to the other thing, but execute passionately, like you said. And it was just so interesting to hear that juxtaposition, because I think a lot of people, if they can't off the top of their head name what their passion is, they feel less than, or it's actually it feels calcifying instead of expanding. And so I love that you said that. And the other thing that I wanted to touch on that you said a number of times, one way or the other, was you talked about the idea of, getting quiet or getting still or listening to how your body responds. And I have this idea that the truth has a certain volume and it's quiet and it never ever gets louder. And so there's so many distractions and opinions and media that are able to distract us from the truth. And if we want to actually hear the truth, the only way we can hear it is to tune out all that other stuff, the noise and the frequencies and the distractions and the opinions, and just sit super quietly with the truth. And she's always waiting there, ready to share, which way to go, or what feels like a yes or what feels like a no.
Yeah, it's well said. I will say that I believe that to be true. And I believe that certain lessons, the universe screams louder and louder. I remember from being a child, Dr. Maya Angelou talking with Oprah about this, and this concept of like the universe starts to talk to you in a whisper. And when you don't listen, then it sends a little pebble at your window, and then it sends a rock, and then it sends a really big rock, and then it sends a boulder. And that if you're not listening, it's those like cataclysmic things that happen because we just weren't listening and paying attention. And so I also like that too, that not every lesson is going to be that obvious. Some are they're always on that frequency of whisper. But I think at the end of the day, the point remains the same, that if we consistently tune into ourselves, even if, and this is not me sitting on a meditation pillow saying to everyone, like, I am enlightened, I have this like epiphany every time I sit down and meditate. It's not the case at all. Most of the times I walk out and I was like, meh, like glad I did that, but like nothing really interesting happened, so to speak. But at the end of the day, I'm constantly reminded that that's not what it's about. It's about the commitment to doing it. It's about the honoring of the self in the doing of it. And that it's just about letting the nervous system and the brain slow down and connect with each other enough, as opposed to just being in the doing all of the time, which we are so acculturated to be.
Hmm. Um, I want to talk about, if we can, what it looks like to work with you. You talked about your clients, and we were speaking before we started recording about the idea of, what you've learned from building a house, and how does that translate to working with your clients with respect to, one dimensional, two dimensional, three dimensional, and so on.
Yes, I love that you're bringing this up. So, like I said, I definitely have the like woo in me and meets the strategy. And so I've come to find that any situation that we're in life becomes this mechanism for our learning, especially as business owners. Like our businesses become this space that is the ultimate crucible for our growth and learning. And I'm finding that the same is true in a house build project, and that it almost feels magnified because it's a space I personally had no experience. Like I knew very little about supply chain and construction and interior design on the build side, or all of the ways that you project manage the multiple trades and people that are involved. And there's just so many steps and pieces in the process. And so as I've been going through the process, I'm like, wow, like there are moments where I'm letting it really get the best of me, which I'm not really like happy to share, but like, it's just the honest truth is that there are moments where I've let the stress get the best of me. And in those moments, I've had to step back and be like, okay, what have I learned before? Like, how can I apply that to this? And one of the things that keeps coming back for me is what's the end goal? And what's the path of least resistance to get me to that end goal? So when I would find myself brushing up against issues with wanting to be in control or wanting things to go faster, or for me, a big one was really being not pleased with the way that communication happens with most people in this industry, which means slow and almost none, versus like I have been self-trained to communicate directly, communicate regularly, communicate quickly. It's part of why I think I've been successful in my businesses is I treat people in a way that I think is honoring to the way that I would want to be treated as well, and that I think helps move the needle forward. But I had to get to this point of saying, where are the lessons for me in this, and how do I just take them for what they are and keep focused on the bigger picture rather than trying to fight every battle along the way? And it's interesting because not only are these things that I'm having to learn with and for myself, but there's so many people that intersect with this through all of the people that we partner with on this process, and with my fiance and I in doing it together. And so things that I had thought, okay, I've done so much work on these things in myself, whether it's, letting things go and trusting and delegating and losing control on things in like a way that is trusting, or money stuff or speed and efficiency and like all of these other things, they're coming back rearing their head in this process. And I'm just being reminded that we are, I've never thought I was done, but like just constantly being slapped in the face with the reminder that we are certainly never done in our process. I think when we are done is when we die. And so it's just been this really interesting place to stare straight into the things that I have to keep learning and growing with, but also from the metaphysical side, to go from an idea and say, I have this idea of this house that I want, and then bringing the people to kind of be a part of our team to make it a reality, and then see it go from just something in my brain to learning how to actualize that to paper in a two-dimensional format, to now we're in the framing stage to seeing this three-dimensional thing that we can walk in and feel, and to eventually it'll be this like 3/40 thing of you're living in it, you're experiencing it, you're feeling it, like the energy is there. I'm also designing every fixture, finish, everything. So like putting the intention into every single nook, cranny, ounce, inch, etc. of this property. I'm like, that is manifestation at its finest. That is ideation to creation in its truest essence. And I really hope that, and I made this same proclamation to myself when I was 23 and bought a house because I had a restraining order against my landlord, that I would go in there and remember the gratitude I had for it ongoingly, that I wouldn't constantly be on to the next thing, which is very easy to lose sight of. But I hope the same when we get into this house eventually, that I'll be able to look at it and say, remember what it took to get here, be grateful for all of these things, and let this be emblematic of what is possible when we have just a tiny idea. Even though I didn't know that we would be able to afford it, I didn't know like all of the big questions one has of how do you do it, who's going to help you, how is this possible, how long does it take, and then it will be a thing and we will be living in it. And so I hope for anyone who's like, I have big ideas and I don't know how to get there, that perhaps you just think back to something in your life that was once an idea that now is your actual situation, and remember that that once felt distant.
I love that you gave that parallel analogy, because for those people who are, signing on to work with you, like, you have so many tools in your Swiss Army knife of not only life but business, right? And just being able to walk people through, again, from ideation to creation. What do you do when you experience fear?
Well, first, I kind of try to name it. I think fear lives and breathes and grows in the not being named and the like just letting it take over. And so I certainly still feel fear a lot. Like there's a lot in my life that I'm constantly growing into, which often means that I'm brushing up against some amount of fear of like, I don't know how to do that thing, or that's going to really put me out there and on the hook, or, that's going to be a life altering choice or whatever the reason is. But I think just the naming of it and then immediately going to why is it that I'm feeling this? Like, is it biological? Is it like an actual protective mechanism, which is rarely the case? And then typically it's more well, I'm afraid of looking stupid, or I'm afraid of losing money, or I'm afraid of opportunity cost being lost, or something else. And then it's really getting to the core of it. Like Tim Ferriss is famously known for saying, like, asking why 7 times over and over to get to the root of what's going on underneath something. It's very similar to that of just, well, why do I feel that way? And why do I feel that way? And what's really going on? And then I can address that thing. And sometimes that thing comes from like a childhood trauma or scarring. And then I have certain like visualization practices that I can do to help me rewire cognitively that memory to try and heal it and begin to move in a direction beyond it. It's not an instant thing, but it's a step.
Mhm.
Other times it's just addressing it and saying, like, so what? Like, if that's the thing, will I be able to handle it? Usually the answer is yes. And then it's like, fine, get back into the action. And other times it's like, no, actually, that's not something that I want. And then it's like, okay, great. Then that fear was sort of protecting me and I can make a different decision.
I love that, because for anybody who's, trying to find their purpose, trying to start a business or build a business, these things inevitably come up. And the reason I asked you that is because I wanted to hear your always well executed answer, because essentially, you are a genius at turning something intangible into something tangible. And I call that roots and wings. Originally I was terrified of public speaking, and then I thought to myself, well, it's not really possible to be afraid of public speaking, because it's not like a thing. You can't touch it or fix it. Conveniently so, thank you, nervous system. But what I realized was, when I parsed it out, I separated into what I now call roots and wings. So the roots part is a practical, tactical stuff that you talk about. And then the wing stuff is like, what am I actually afraid of? What is the fear beneath the fear? What is the fear asking me to look at that I don't want to see? And while, you might not step onto a stage or start a business feeling 1000% confident, it does, though, allow you to turn fear into motion. Like, courage is fear in motion, and just really starting to uncover, like, is it a rational fear? Is it not a rational fear? Because oftentimes it's those quiet voices, to your point, that we don't give a voice to, that keep us stuck and have us playing small and believing the lies that we've been told, grain of sand by grain of sand. And then we have that yes moment in our body, and in a nanosecond we say no, and we think of the odds and the logic and why couldn't be me, and we find ourselves on a beach. So
It's an interesting point on so many levels, but in particular on that like yes feeling or not, because often fear can restrict that or constrain it and make it seem as though it's a no, when really our body is just being confused by the fear. And the way that you described it is so beautiful, because really what you described it as is fear can also be that place that's the mechanism for growth and for the learning. So when we look at it and we're like, well, what is it that I'm not addressing? Like, what's really underneath this? Then that becomes part of that scavenger hunt we were talking about, to say, like, here's a moment to grow again. And I can imagine that there's no one listening to your specific show that isn't interested in being a growth oriented person. So I hope that we can all look at that and say, that's exciting. That's a place for me to grow and be better, because when I'm better, not only do I feel more aligned and equipped to show up in the world, but it's also like most of us are purpose driven, most of us are impact driven. It allows us to have a more centered and aligned place from which to deliver that impact.
absolutely. I know that there's going to be a lot of people who are looking to seek you out. If people are looking to work with you or they want to learn more about you, where is the best place that they can find you?
two places. My website is darrah.co, darrah.co, or Instagram. I show up regularly there at DarrahB.
Awesome. And we're going to have all of these resources in the show notes. I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time. It's always just such a gift to hang out with you.
You too. Thanks, Shelli.
Thanks so much for hanging out with us today on The Yes Effect Show. If you liked this episode, it'd be amazing if you could rate it, review it, and share it with a friend, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And lastly, if you want a behind-the-scenes look, we're going to continue the conversation in the Facebook group, The Yes Effect Inner Circle. So hop on over there, a place to believe, belong, and become.